Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're tackling quite a stack of source material. It's definitely highly charged, intensely partisan, actually. And it all centers on one single defining theme. This idea of deep political divisions in America, specifically concerning loyalty, criticism, and what these sources, well, what they repeatedly call contempt and hatred for America. So our mission for you listening is to quickly and thoroughly synthesize this pretty complex narrative. It focuses on Representative Ilhan Omar of Minnesota. We'll be navigating through specific legal claims, some really aggressive political rhetoric, and a comparison the sources draw between two profoundly opposing worldviews.
Yeah, we really have to start by acknowledging the intensity here. This material, it's not neutral analysis, not at all. These sources are making a very specific, very forceful argument. And to really get that argument, we have to jump right into the recent political flashpoint that kind of frames the whole discussion. It's a deeply personal and, frankly, antagonistic statement made right after the passing of a prominent conservative figure.
Okay, yeah, let's unpack that setup. Because the source material uses the death of conservative activist Charlie Kirk as, well, the dramatic catalyst for its entire analysis, doesn't it? Charlie Kirk, founder of Turning Point USA, and, for millions of his followers, the sources point out, he represented this really clear, youthful conviction. An unapologetic, pretty forthright belief that America is exceptional, rooted in Christian identity, and something worth fighting for, politically, culturally.
Right. And then almost immediately after his death, the source really highlights Rep. Ilhan Omar's remarkably sharp and very public dismissal of his entire life's work. Her specific quote, the provocative one that the source positions as the ultimate expression of this conflict was, "Charlie Kirk's legacy belongs in the dustbin of history."
Wow. Yeah, when you read that, it just hits differently than standard political disagreement. It feels like more, like an attempt to delegitimize, maybe even erase, an entire political and cultural movement. It seems the source is immediately putting a kind of moral framework around this critique. How do they justify framing that specific quote as an attempt to erase rather than just, harsh partisan commentary?
Well, that justification is the core of their argument, really. The source argues this isn't just about policy disagreements. It's a statement they see as attempting to delegitimize the work of a, let's face it, highly visible Christian leader and one of America's most recognizable defenders, at least on that side. By saying his legacy belongs in the dustbin of history, Omar, in the source's view, isn't just criticizing Kirk. They argue she's expressing contempt for the whole ideology he embodied, that patriotic, faith-driven defense of America. So that single quote, it really sets up the ideological clash we see analyzed across all this material.
Okay, that definitely makes the mission clearer. We need to understand the path, the trajectory that leads a sitting member of Congress, someone with her own really incredible backstory of finding refuge, to make such a forcefully condemnatory statement about an opponent, especially right after his death. So for you, the listener, here's the plan. First, we'll unpack Omar's background and how the source analyzes this shift in her narrative. Then we'll dive into the specific, persistent legal and ethical controversies, some proven, some not. And finally, we'll synthesize what the source material claims is a consistent, documented pattern of, well, contemptuous speech that defines their critique of her time in office. All right, let's start with her origin story. It's crucial because, as you said, the source material deliberately juxtaposes this really powerful, compelling background against the rhetoric that came later. This contrast, it feels like the emotional foundation of the source's whole argument.
Oh, absolutely. The background is vital context for their critique. Omar's story, it begins in Somalia, torn apart by civil war. She fled that conflict, endured years in a huge, sprawling Kenyan refugee camp with her family, and then ultimately they were resettled here in the United States in the mid-1990s. She successfully petitioned for citizenship and was naturalized in the year 2000. She's just 17 years old.
I mean, that's just a remarkable journey. Survival, resilience, success against incredible odds. And the source points out quite pointedly that for most immigrants who follow a similar path, fleeing violence or oppression, finding safety here, their journey is almost always framed and received as a tale of gratitude. Logically, you'd expect it to end with, well, profound thanksgiving for safety, for opportunity, for the chance America provides, which was denied back home.
And this is exactly where the source material introduces its main criticism about her personal narrative. They state it explicitly, repeatedly. They note that Omar's version of this story is, in their view, dramatically different. Instead of expressing that profound thankfulness or, embracing America with affection, the source claims her rhetoric consistently frames the nation differently, not as a welcoming refuge, but as, quote, irredeemably corrupt and oppressive.
That's a huge divergence, a really intentional framing, it sounds like. Why does the source dwell so heavily on this particular narrative shift? What's the political point they're trying to make?
Well, the source is making an implied argument, really, about what they see as the responsibility of immigrants to the nation that received them. That's the subtext. They contend that her rise in politics wasn't accompanied by expressions of loyalty or love for America. Instead, they say it was marked by accusation after accusation against it. End quote. They argue she sees her role not as a builder in her new home, but more as a perpetual critic of what she views as a deeply flawed system. So for the source, this contrast between the refuge offered and the persistent foundational critique she delivers, that's the bedrock of the contempt charge they level against her. It suggests, in their view, a lack of the gratitude they believed is, well, owed.
Okay, so the argument's foundation is really built on that perceived betrayal of the expected tale of gratitude. It sets up this essential conflict between maybe the promise of assimilation and the practice of systemic critique. All right, now here's where it gets, well, really interesting, maybe more complex. Moving from the rhetoric to documented claims. The sources lay out both proven violations and these persistent, unproven allegations that have kind of shadowed her career, creating what critics call an ethical cloud. We really need to separate what's still just alleged from what has been definitively confirmed.
Definitely. And let's spend some time on the allegation that's proven the most resistant to any clear resolution, the one that generates the most political heat, frankly, that the brother marriage claim. This stems from a civil marriage Omar entered into back in 2009. The man was Ahmed Nur Said Elmi, described as a British Somali. Now, critics in the source material documents this extensively have long alleged that Elmi is, in fact, her biological sibling. And the allegation continues that the marriage was essentially a sham, entered into solely to help him gain illegal immigration benefits.
And just to be absolutely crystal clear for you, the listener, fact checkers, official inquiries, they still label this specific allegation, the part about them being siblings, as unproven. There are no definitive official records produced so far that substantiate that really explosive claim of kinship and immigration fraud.
That's correct. It remains unproven in any official capacity. However, the sources dig into why this suspicion lingers so strongly, despite the lack of hard proof. The articles detail how Omar herself has provided what they call evasive answers and confusing explanations regarding the timeline of her relationships, her divorces, her separations. This leaves significant gaps, inconsistencies in her personal narrative that she hasn't publicly clarified or refused to clarify. Furthermore, there's investigative reporting cited by the source pointing to discrepancies in her tax filings at certain points. These suggest she might have filed joint returns with one individual while still legally married to another, which just further muddies the waters, both legally and personally.
So while the really sensational claim, the sibling part, is unproven, it's the surrounding ambiguity, the lack of clear, transparent answers. That's what the source uses to keep the pressure on. It's like the fog around it, not the hard proof itself, that keeps that political fire burning.
Exactly. It's the unanswered questions that allow the allegation to persist politically. And the source argues that this tendency towards, let's say, obfuscation is actually confirmed by a separate, fully adjudicated case. This one involved a confirmed violation of state campaign finance laws during her time back in the Minnesota legislature.
Okay, tell us more about that confirmed violation. What happened there?
Right, this violation concerned using campaign funds for things that weren't allowed under Minnesota rules. Specifically, travel to other states for events not directly related to her state legislative duties, and also paying her divorce lawyer using campaign money. This wasn't just an allegation, it went through the process. It was fully adjudicated by the state's campaign finance board. As a result, she was formally required to reimburse over $3,000 in those improperly used funds, and she also had to pay a civil fine of $500. Now, the source argues that while this financial misuse might seem relatively minor compared to, say, allegations of immigration fraud, it establishes a key part of the pattern they allege. They frame it as showing a clear willingness to, quote, bend rules to her benefit and show little regard for the law when it serves her personal or political gain. So that confirmed violation, it acts as a kind of factual anchor for the source's overall character assessment and their broader claims.
Okay, that confirmed legal violation, it leads us right into the next critical question the sources raise. The actual legal reality around those frequent political calls for her deportation. You hear it a lot, especially after controversial comments like the one about Charlie Kirk. People demanding she be stripped of citizenship and removed. We absolutely have to separate that political demand from the strict legal facts here.
Absolutely crucial distinction. The core question is simple. Can a naturalized citizen like Ilhan Omar be deported based on these kinds of allegations or even her political statements. And the legal conclusion offered consistently by the source material, based on current law, is unambiguous. Legally, no, she cannot be deported, not unless her citizenship is first stripped through a very specific and highly difficult process called denaturalization.
Right. And how high is that legal bar specifically? When we talk about denaturalization, what exactly does the government have to prove to make that happen?
It's one of the highest legal bars the government can possibly attempt to clear. It's intentionally difficult. Under the federal law, that's 8 U.S.C. Section 1451, denaturalization requires clear, convincing, and unequivocal proof. Proof that citizenship was either illegally procured, meaning she wasn't actually eligible in the first place, or that it was obtained through willful material misrepresentation. The burden is entirely on the government to prove, essentially, that she lied intentionally about something important, specifically to get citizenship back in 2000.
And what's really fascinating here and makes it even harder is how the Supreme Court clarified what material misrepresentation actually means, especially in politically charged cases. We should probably dive a bit deeper into that 2017 ruling, Maslanjak v. United States. That seems key.
Oh, Maslanjak is absolutely crucial. You really can't understand the limits on denaturalization without it. So Elena Maslanjak, she was petitioned in that case. She was a Bosnian Serb refugee who sought and obtained U.S. citizenship. During her naturalization application process, she lied. Specifically, she lied about her husband's past involvement in a Bosnian Serb military unit during the conflict there. That unit had engaged in atrocities. Later, the government found out about the lie and sought to revoke her citizenship precisely because she had lied during the application process.
Okay, so she definitely lied on the application, no question there. But the legal fight was about whether that specific lie was material enough to justify taking away her citizenship years later.
Exactly. That was the core legal question. Did any lie suffice, or did the lie have to be important? The Supreme Court decided, and this is the key part, that for a lie to be considered material in the context of denaturalization, it must have been directly related to the applicant's eligibility for citizenship in the first place. Critically, the Maslanjak ruling demands that the government prove the falsehood was significant enough that it would have changed the outcome of the naturalization process itself. In other words, the government has to show that if she told the truth back then, she would have been denied citizenship based on the law at that time. If they can't prove that link, that the lie directly led to her getting citizenship she otherwise wouldn't have qualified for, then the denaturalization attempt fails. It means the lie has to be about something fundamental to her eligibility, not just any falsehood or something she merely kept quiet about.
Wow, that sets a really, really high standard for the government to meet, especially when dealing with events or allegations like the marriage issue that occurred years after she actually became a citizen. And here's the critical timeline connection, right? But one that fundamentally undercuts those political demands for her removal based on the brother marriage claim.
Precisely. It's all about the timing. Omar became a naturalized U.S. citizen way back in the year 2000. The controversial marriage to Ahmed said El-Mai, the one that's the subject of those immigration fraud allegations. That happened 9 years later, in 2009. Therefore, the source concludes, quite logically based on Maslanjak, that unless some kind of hard, concrete proof emerges showing that she lied back in 2000, during that initial process of obtaining citizenship, and that this hypothetical lie was so material it would have automatically resulted in her denial under the law then, deportation is simply not legally possible. So regardless of how loudly critics demand it or how politically expedient it might seem to some, the legal bar established by the Supreme Court just hasn't been met based on the public information regarding that later 2009 marriage.
Okay, so the law, as it stands, essentially shields her legal status as a citizen, which means the entire political battle, the focus of the criticism, it has to shift. And indeed, it seems it has shifted almost entirely to her public record, her speech, her conduct, her statements.
True. Right, since her legal status is, as the source puts it, effectively untouchable under current legal precedents, the source material pivots entirely. It focuses squarely on her rhetoric, the accumulated public record that these sources label as a consistent, documented pattern of contempt. This is where the core political argument of the source really resides, using her own words against her instance by instance.
Exactly. And the pattern, according to these sources, is built around 4 major incidents. They argue that when you take these together, they confirm the narrative of contempt that the source is trying to establish. We can start with the first one they highlight, the minimization, as they see it, of the September 11th attacks in 2019. Right, this happened during a fundraising event. It was hosted by SHARE, the Council on American Islamic Relations. She was addressing the audience, and in describing the 9/11 Paris attacks, she used the phrase, Well, she described it as merely an event where some people did something.
Yeah, let's just pause on that specific phrase, some people did something. Because the source dedicates significant analysis to what they see as its rhetorical power, or perhaps its rhetorical failure. For thousands of families who lost loved ones on 9/11, and for many, many Americans recalling that day, that phrase, it sounds like a deliberate effort to strip the attack of its specific horror, its intent, its scale, the identity of the perpetrator's al-Qaeda. The source argues that phrasing rhetorically diminishes the tragedy. It makes it sound vague, almost like an accident, something happened, rather than acknowledging it as the, quote, most brutal terror attack on American soil, committed by defined enemies with a specific ideology.
And the political reaction to that was immediate and fierce, wasn't it? Critics, including members of Congress from both parties, actually, publicly condemned the comment. They noted, as the source points out, that if that exact phrase had been used by, say, a conservative about a tragedy affecting a different community, the condemnation would likely have been instantaneous and politically lethal. The source also notes the location that Pfeiffer fundraiser as adding weight, in their view, to the perceived minimization.
Then later that same year, 2019, another major controversy erupted. This one centered on what critics identified as a classic anti-Semitic trope. This was the Benjamins quote. She tweeted, "It's all about the Benjamins, baby," in reference to U.S. political support for Israel, specifically citing AIPAC, the lobbying group.
Right, and that required a swift clarification, didn't it? Because critics immediately and very widely identified that phrase as echoing these deeply rooted historical anti-Semitic ideas. Can you elaborate a bit on the historical weight the source assigns to that specific language? Why was Benjamin's seen as so problematic?
Well, the phrase, "it's all about the Benjamins," referring to $100 bills featuring Benjamin Franklin, is interpreted by the source and by many critics at the time as invoking a very old and harmful anti-Semitic trope. The trope suggests that Jewish money, Jewish financial influence, secretly controls politics, particularly foreign policy decisions regarding Israel. This idea of hidden, powerful financial manipulation by Jewish people, it goes back centuries in anti-Semitic literature and propaganda. It's deeply offensive and has historically been used to incite suspicion and hatred. Now, Omar did eventually apologize for the specific language she used, acknowledging its problematic connotations. But the source emphasizes that, in their view, the rhetorical damage was done. It positioned her, they argue, as someone willing to employ rhetoric that relies on recognized historical biases that breed hatred and suspicion, even if unintentionally.
Okay, so that's two major incidents in 2019. The pattern, according to the source, continues into 2021. This time, she was accused of effectively equating the U.S. military and the State of Israel with designated terrorist groups in a pretty stunning public statement.
Yeah, this was in a tweet. She was commenting on international justice and accountability. And she stated, quote, "We have seen unthinkable atrocities committed by the U.S., Hamas, Israel, Afghanistan, and the Taliban." Now, the placement in that sentence, listing the United States military and the Democratic State of Israel alongside terrorist organizations like Hamas and the Taliban, that immediately generated fierce backlash. Even prominent members of her own Democratic Party, particularly Jewish Democrats in Congress, they demanded immediate clarification. They pointed out that the very construction of the sentence seemed to place America and Israel in the same moral category as groups universally recognized as terrorist organizations and egregious human rights abusers.
And her clarification later was that she wasn't making a moral equivalence, right?
Yeah.
She insisted she was only referencing ongoing International Criminal Court, the ICC, investigations into potential war crimes allegedly committed by all the parties listed in those various conflicts. She framed it as a legal reference.
That was her explanation, yes. She tried to frame it as referring to legal processes, not inherent moral character. But the source argues that the initial visceral impact of the public statement that perceived moral equivalence created lasting rhetorical damage that the subsequent clarification couldn't fully undo. For the source, this demonstrated at best a deep moral ambiguity regarding the actions of her adopted country and its allies, and at worst, an underlying hostility.
Which brings us finally to the most recent claim cited by the source, the one that ties perhaps most directly into their overall contempt thesis. This was her claim in June 2025 about where the United States stands globally.
That's right. According to the source, she went on record claiming that the United States was actively becoming one of the worst countries in the world. The source argues this statement is strategically devastating for her critics, because in their view, it reveals far more than just standard partisan disagreement over policy, like taxes or healthcare. They claim it reveals her overall disgust, as they put it, with the nation that gave her refuge. The argument is, When an individual who serves in the national legislature, who holds a U.S. passport, enjoys the freedoms and protections offered by this country, publicly declares it one of the worst, the source argues that this crosses a line. It's definitive evidence in their eyes of contempt, not just legitimate criticism. So the recurrence of these incidents from, as they see it, belittling 9/11, to using anti-Semitic tropes, to equating the U.S. with the Taliban, to calling it one of the worst countries is used to build this case. To argue that her fundamental posture toward America is consistently defined by disdain, not affection or loyalty.
Okay, so what does this accumulated pattern of speech, as presented by the source, actually mean when we connect it back to the very beginning of our deep dive? We have to return to that initial, highly personal, very harsh judgment she leveled against Charlie Kirk, because the source sets up this intentional, almost moral contrast between these two figures. They're presented as representatives of fundamentally opposing political ideologies and worldviews.
It's exactly. Let's fully flesh out how the source summarizes Charlie Kirk's life work in contrast. Now, they acknowledge, implicitly at least, that Kirk was certainly not perfect, nor was he universally beloved. Even on the right, he was controversial. But his legacy, as detailed by the source, was built on a very particular ideology, defending what he saw as America's foundational identity, engaging young people specifically in conservative politics, and very overtly promoting Christianity in the public square. His activism, they note, was anchored in his faith. He openly spoke of Jesus Christ as the basis for American virtue and exceptionalism. So he represented, in this framing, the side of the political spectrum dedicated to assimilation, tradition, and the vocal defense of American culture as he understood it.
Right. And then we have Omar's explicit personal venom aimed directly at him, particularly in those September 2025 remarks she made following his death. The sources quote her saying she believed Kirk was, quote, a reprehensible, hateful man. Strong words.
Very strong. And she went much further than just policy disagreement or calling him hateful. She tied his alleged hatred directly to her own identity, her own experience. She framed the opposition as being fundamentally about race and her status as a woman, specifically a Muslim woman of color. She claimed, and this is a direct quote cited, "He didn't believe that we should have equal access to anything. He also just didn't even believe I could be smart enough. I could have thoughts that could be equal to a white man." Right there. So the implication there, according to the source's interpretation, is that any political opposition to her or her ideas isn't just policy-driven disagreement, but is actually rooted in white supremacy and misogyny directed personally at her.
And the source material seems to focus intensely on the emotional weight of that response, right? Emphasizing that these were, quote, words of personal venom, spoken with satisfaction while a family mourned. That specific detail feels intended to underscore the perceived level of deep personal animosity and what they portray as a complete lack of political decorum or even basic human decency in the face of death.
Yes, the source uses that framing to highlight the perceived cruelty. And this is precisely where the source ties it all together, exposing what they see as the two divergent worldviews and linking it directly back to the central theme of contempt. When Omar declares that Kirk's legacy representing that defense of traditional Christian America belongs in the dustbin of history, the source argues she reveals a core belief system, that America's defenders, those who champion its traditional faith and identity, must be systematically erased, delegitimized, tossed aside, while conversely its consistent critics and detractors, figures like herself, in their view are elevated to positions of moral authority and political legitimacy. The conflict, as framed explicitly by the source, is between this ideology of immigrant gratitude and patriotic defense of America versus an ideology of progressive critique and fundamental contempt for American identity and history.
So the source material wraps up with a series of pretty sharp rhetorical questions. They build directly on this established pattern of behavior they've laid out. And they basically ask the listener, you, to consider the profound implications of her conduct while she's actively serving in the national legislature of the country she's criticizing.
Yeah, these concluding questions, they essentially challenge her loyalty and the basic coherence of her position as the source sees it. If she publicly asserts that the U.S. is becoming one of the worst countries, the source rhetorically asks, why remain in it? Why choose to be a citizen, let alone a representative, of a country you hold in such profoundly low esteem? If she insists, through her statements, that America belongs in the same moral category as the Taliban, why serve in its Congress? Why accept its salary, funded by taxpayers? Why pledge allegiance to its political structure and constitution?
And critically, they ask, If she cannot restrain herself from, as they put it, sneering at Christians, conservatives, and patriots, many of whom are the very people she's elected to represent, whose taxes pay her salary, why claim the title of American representative at all, the source is fundamentally challenging the very premise of her holding office, given what they perceive as her deep internal animosity toward the nation itself and a large portion of its people.
And this leads the article's author to pivot directly and very forcefully to a specific recommendation. It's what they explicitly label the honorable course of action for her.
That sounds like a very pointed conclusion indeed. Tell us exactly what the source suggests she should do.
Well, the conclusion drawn by the source is completely unambiguous and frankly highly inflammatory. It pulls no punches. It argues that America is clearly the object of her scorn, not her loyalty. And therefore it suggests that the only honorable course for her would be to renounce her adopted country entirely, to leave the United States. Perhaps they suggest even returning to Somalia, if that is where her true loyalties or sympathies actually rest. The source explicitly calls it shameful to sit in the U.S. Congress while simultaneously, in their words, dripping contempt for the nation and its people. They suggest her continued presence in office, given her rhetoric, constitutes a profound political and moral hypocrisy.
Wow. Okay. And this brings us right to the final provocative conclusion of the source material, where they perform that ultimate rhetorical reversal, using her own famous phrase against her, the real dustbin of history.
Exactly. The source asserts quite confidently that history will not remember Ilhan Omar as a courageous, unifying figure or a transformative, progressive leader. Instead, it predicts she will be remembered primarily as a politician who spent her career, quote, mocking her adopted country, belittling its national tragedies, and insulting its defenders. Therefore, the source concludes with this final twist. It is Omar's own rhetoric, her bitterness and her disdain, this relentless pattern they've documented, which they frame as contempt for the American project, that truly belongs in the dustbin of history. Not the legacy of someone like Charlie Kirk, who defended the nation. It's a really powerful final rhetorical flourish. It encapsulates the entire argument presented in the article, that she, for them, symbolizes this deep internal conflict raging today over what it even means to be an American. So just to wrap this up, let's leave you, the learner, with a final thought, something to reflect on, drawing from the sheer intensity of the source material we've just walked through. Reflect on the really profound implications. What does it mean when an individual holds one of the highest elected offices in a nation that they concurrently and very publicly label as one of the worst countries in the world? This raises a much bigger question, really, relevant to any political system, far beyond just this one political figure. When does sustained, fierce, even necessary political criticism cross some kind of perceived line, shifting into what gets labeled as outright contempt for the nation's core identity? And maybe more importantly, how does that perceived distinction between criticism and contempt grant different kinds of political power, or perhaps create different kinds of political vulnerability for both the critics and the criticized alike? Something to think about.
Definitely something to think about. A fascinating and, intensely detailed examination of a very difficult, very charged political narrative, all synthesized entirely from the specific and, let's be clear, highly opinionated source material that you shared with us. Thank you for completing this deep dive. We will see you on the next one.
In the heart of this nation, under skies so blue, there's a spirit that's stirring, values strong and true. From the mountains to the prairies, from the cities to the sea, we stand for liberty, for faith and family. We're diving deep into the heart of what we believe. Conservative values in our souls, they're interweaved. With courage and with honor, we'll hold our ground for freedom, for tradition, in this land we found. We cherish our Constitution, the words that set us free, the right to bear arms, to speak and to agree. We honor our forefathers who fought with steadfast might. In every town